I hate you, YouTube video recorder. I haven't been recording a lot of videos lately. I got a new job, and I'm always exhausted. So, recording videos my output has slowed down. It might be a relief to some of you. Um, but I just wanted to think through this comment that Ella left me like a month ago or something. Um, because I think it's an interesting comment, and I think it's sort of at the heart of um, the political disagreement that's happening here, right? I think it's sort of at the heart of differences in how politics is thought. Um, I left a comment on Robert Hartlepool's video, and it was like multi-part comment. Ella responded to one part of it, and the part that she was responding to is as follows. In fact, this was what was most interesting about Occupy Wall Street, the refusal to articulate a program. This was what was confusing to people. Anything that confuses people politically is good. What needs to be challenged is how we think political activity. In America, a political protest tends to just elicit an eye roll. We're used to it. We've seen it before. We need to not just challenge power. We need to challenge the way that we challenge power. We need to do things that can't be labeled and dismissed. And Ella responds, quoting me to begin with, quote, anything that confuses people politically is good. She says, no, it's not. I would argue that it's exactly this confusing message, the lack of demands, which made Occupy Wall Street completely impotent. I'm going to start there. Let's start with some wordplay. Mind you, I'm just going to be thinking through this comment because I don't know, right? I don't have political solutions. I don't pretend to have political solutions, unlike some other people on YouTube. So making strong arguments and strong cases is not my business when talking about politics. What I can do is critique things, and that's sort of what I'm good at, and that's sort of what I'm going to stick to. So this might be a little, just kind of trying to explore the topic here. Try to explore the topic, and so therefore this might be a little rebelly. But if you're subscribed to me, you're probably already okay with that. She says, I would argue that this lack of demands is what made Occupy Wall Street completely impotent. Now, wordplay. Impotent. Impotent, right? Negation of potency. Potency being power or strength or something like that. This statement, this lack of demands is what robbed Occupy Wall Street of their power, right? Is problematic, right? I spent a little time in Zuccotti Park, not too much, but I'm from New York, so and I knew some of the people who were participating in that. And I was in support of Occupy Wall Street. I thought it was a good thing. But what's important about Occupy Wall Street is that it wasn't, or the reason I find Occupy Wall Street to be such an interesting event is that it didn't function along the same sort of logic as traditional political protests. There wasn't a program, again, right? They refused to articulate a program. And I see in that refusal a certain kind of potential. Now, what was the critique that Occupy Wall Street was making? What was the crux of what they were saying? And mind you, we should remember that Occupy Wall Street had different layers, right? There were different levels of it. You know, it wasn't a monolith, right? It wasn't like there was a bullet point list of things that everybody was in support of. So there are different sort of layers of critique happening at the same time. But I think at its most radical, The statement that Occupy Wall Street was making was the system as such is problematic, even further, structurally violent, right? Whatever you like. The system as such is, I don't even want to say broken, because broken implies that it was at some point not broken, right? Some people would make that claim, right? Some people would claim that there was a sort of glory days when capitalism was good, right? And the repeal of Glass-Steagall is the moment where capitalism sort of fell apart, something like that, right? Like that's the more liberal version of the Occupy Wall Street critique. The more radical one is that capitalism is, as such, is broken and problematic and violent, and exploitative, and pick your language. And the democratic mechanisms that we have, representative democracy, etc., particularly the United States articulation of that, those mechanisms are not strong enough to deal with the problems at hand. So we can't appeal to that, right? That there's something self-refuting about appealing to state power. So this is the situation, or the spirit of Occupy Wall Street that I most identify with was in that critique, in that sort of zone of thought. Now, given that's the situation, given that's the grievance that's being expressed, right? I mean, that's a critique, or that's a grievance about all of reality in a certain way, right? Like, it's a grievance about the relations that structure our world, not just at a domestic level, but also foreign relations, whatever you like. The question is, how do you articulate a program that doesn't fall back into that, right? It seems to me that you can't appeal to state power to do that, right? There's something inherently self-subverting about that. You can't appeal to the private sector, obviously. That's obviously problematic. So where do you appeal to? Where do you point to, right? We need to stop this thing, right? It's not that there's some particular thing that needs to be stopped, right? It's not like the Vietnam War protests or the Iraq War protests. We are against this thing, and that thing is what needs to be ended. What does it even mean in some way? And I say this as someone who identifies as a radical leftist. What does it even mean to say that we are opposed to capitalism as such, right? How do you do that without reifying capitalism? How do you do that without without, I don't know, getting caught up in all sorts of false language? I think it's a difficult problem, right? I think articulating a radical standpoint in the world in which we live is extremely difficult. That's the point of my other videos towards Franks, right? As somebody who's a radical, I don't know how to articulate that position in some compelling, proper, coherent way that can't just be sucked back up and recommodified. That's the issue. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that we should stop trying. Now, so the point is, what possible program could have been articulated? I don't think that, maybe you could have done something in a pragmatic way. Again, some people want to reinstitute Glass-Steagall or something like that. These sort of pragmatic gestures. We can fix this little thing here. We can fix this thing here. We can institute this kind of law. We can social democracy. That's what's at work there. Let's defend the welfare state, and let's try to tweak it in these different ways. Um, that to me is not sufficient. That to me doesn't work, right? I think that in order for the substance, if you like, of Occupy Wall Street to manifest itself, um, it's just not a matter of pragmatic politics, right? There has to be something like um, uh, an ideal, right? There has to be an idealistic politics, um, a revolutionary politics, if you like. I don't mean to use that word in the old sense, right? But just a politics that demands a radical break. Um, I don't know how to say that. That anybody who does think that they know how to say that is probably an idiot. They're probably wrong, right? They probably just don't recognize all of the problems at work there. But one thing that's important about that is that Occupy Wall Street, if that's the message of Occupy Wall, or let's say insofar as that's the critique of put forward by Occupy Wall Street, um, Occupy Wall Street was impotent from the get-go. There was no point in which Occupy Wall Street was not impotent, right? It's not that Occupy Wall Street was made impotent; it was in itself impotent. Um, Now, Ella seems to think that that's a bad thing, right? Or that somehow detracts from the importance of it. But what's happening, I think, even though it's impotent, even though Occupy Wall Street never, I don't think, had the potential to universalize itself and to constitute the kind of radical break that's required, um, in order to meet its own demands, if you like. Um, Even though it didn't have that imminent potential, um, the failure of Occupy Wall Street, I think, changes the stage, right? Um, and the action of Occupy Wall Street, the affirmation of what's happening there, changes the stage as well. Um, Occupy Wall Street is the first sort of attempt to protest the system as such, to say that there's something problematic at the core, right? Um, that's very different than protesting against the Vietnam War, protesting against the Iraq War, right? We have some demands. We will protest until those demands are met, right? Like that structure of protest, which has been around for a long time. I mean, it goes back to union strikes, the 8-hour workday. Before that, the 9-hour workday, right? 10-hour workday. There's this long history of sort of political movement and political organization that followed that kind of structure. Here's a program. Here's a list of demands, and we are going to protest until we fulfill those lists of demands. What Occupy Wall Street tried to do was to, or how I read it at least, is that it tried to say that very structure of how to think about protest is in itself insufficient to solve the problems that need to be addressed and talked about. So in some sense, Occupy Wall Street was not just a protest against the structure of capitalism, the structure of the United States political edifice, or something like that. It wasn't just that. It was also a protest against certain modes of protest. Now, the question of impotence, the implication being, if only Occupy Wall Street had articulated a program, we might have gotten somewhere. I don't think that's, first of all, I don't necessarily believe that that's true. I mean, maybe you could have gotten in the same position as the Tea Party. great. I don't think that the point of that was to do that. It was to it wasn't to be sucked into the political apparatus in the way that and that threat was present, right? I mean, you had Bill Clinton showing up and saying yes, tell us your demands, tell us what you want, we can work together and we can legislate things and do a bit like that. Very well could have happened. There was a point there where there was a choice to be made, and I think the great strength of Occupy Wall Street is that it refused that choice. And the reason why it refuses that choice is because the attempt was to open up a space of politics that wasn't contingent on market capitalism or democratic power structure, quote unquote democratic power structures, right? Wasn't contingent on the state or on capital. It was trying to open up a space for something new. Now, Ella says that the lack of demands is what made Occupy Wall Street completely impotent. In other words, another way of saying this, I think, Ella, please tell me if I'm wrong or if I'm misreading you here. But another way to state this is why Occupy Wall Street failed. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that if Occupy Wall Street had articulated a list of demands, that would have been a failure, right? Because it would have been sucked back up into the sort of nexus of political relations that it was opposed to in the first place. If they had said yes to Bill Clinton in that moment, it would have been sucked back up into the structure of power that it was struggling against, or trying to in some sense overcome. But we shouldn't be delusional, right? The sort of political force of Occupy Wall Street definitely collapsed at a certain point. But I don't think that failure is necessarily a bad thing. That failure, Rosa Luxemburg has a line where she says, if you wait for the right moment will never arrive. But I think that there's truth in that. I think another way of reading that line is to suggest that progressive failures, right, can open up the space for thinking of something new, can open up the space of the quote-unquote event, as Badiou calls it, or if you like, the moment of revolution. Or again, I don't mean this in an old sense of taking out guns and something like that, but I mean the moment where you can institute some kind of radical break. Occupy Wall Street decided not to take the easy way out, and this is its great nobility. It decided to be consistent with itself, to be consistent with its own critique, and to say, no, Bill Clinton, we will not issue a list of demands and work with you because we're trying to think of a new way to do politics and to think politics and to enact politics, right? This is what people don't seem to get about Occupy Wall Street, right? It was an attempt to construct a space that was something that would have the potential for something new to arise. Now, I think that's good, and I think that project is what's needed politically. Some people talk about how in the United States we need the rise of a third party. Actually, a lot of people talk about that. That, for me, is in some sense what Occupy Wall Street was doing, but much more radical. Not just a new party, but a new politics, a new way of thinking politics, a new way of articulating politics. That's what's needed. That's the pressing concern. And I think without that, we're doomed. That might sound like a crazy person saying that kind of thing, but I really think that if pressed, I could defend that claim, right? Without some new way of thinking politics, we're doomed. The impotence of Occupy Wall Street, the failure, if you like, of Occupy Wall Street, is not a failure for that cause. There's that old trite at this point Jefferson line, Edison line, where he says, when I was, I didn't fail to make a light bulb 200 times or whatever. I learned 200 different ways to not make a light bulb. This is the value of failure, particularly in the real world, right? Not in some abstract political wonderland. In order for change to happen, you need failures. Failures are good. Failures help radicalize a generation. I think Occupy Wall Street was problematic, at least in part because it was too idealistic and too romantic and perhaps too abstract, not tied enough to the concrete reality of politics. And so something new will happen. I think that that's inevitable. Those grievances didn't disappear, right? The grievances in America continue to be grievances. And so there will be a moment where we try again to articulate a new politics. If that articulation takes place within the language of already existing political forms and structures, that's the failure. That's the impotence. I think we need to dream, and I really mean that, right? Like I think that we need to find new ways to dream. And I think that at some minimal level, Occupy Wall Street did that, right? I think that there was a moment, whether or not that moment sustained itself, but there was a moment where all of a sudden these sort of forces of oppression, right? If I might use that strong term, these sort of mechanisms that just sort of structure our daily lives, these moments looked radically contingent, right? They didn't look as necessary. That in itself is a victory. That's the hardest thing, I think. So how do you dream? And how do you dream in a way that's not abstract? How do you dream in a way that's not dissociated from the real work of politics? How do you conceive of new political spaces that doesn't fall back into the same problems? That's the project, right? That's the real project. For me, and this is probably, the definitive political stance that I'll make on this channel. For me, everything else is just masturbation. So have a good night.